Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given to you by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Michael Salas. Dr. Salas is a doctor of psychology and owner and founder of Vantage Point Counseling Services. Dr. Salas has been featured in the Washington Post, Men's Health, Reader's Digest, and many more. His specialties include trauma, sex, and relationships, and he helps his clients successfully navigate all the challenges they may face. So, Dr. Salas, welcome to the show. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm glad to be here. I'm here in my office in Dallas. So glad to be here.
I gave a brief introduction, but just so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better and what you do, could you please give a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah. So I, again, I'm from the Dallas area. I do a lot of work with trauma and addictions and sexuality. Do a lot of work with relationships too. And those things intertwine a lot. And kind of so it's kind of, even though there's like kind of big range of things that I kind of work with, those things they interact with each other a lot. Also, do a lot of work with the LGBTQ plus population here too. Just being a gay therapist in Dallas as well. So I'm an author of a book called Bridging the Sex Addiction Divide. So which kind of really focuses on like the sex addiction controversy, but also like people. It gets really confusing when people are looking for advice about whether or not they're dealing with sexual compulsivity or not. And so I just kind of wrote something to try to help people kind of find some middle ground on that. And the book itself really focuses on kink awareness, the LGBTQ plus community, and also like consensual non-monogamy, because a lot of times those are people who can get unfairly stigmatized as being sex addicts without any context. And so the book really works on like kind of trying to find some balance with like a sex positive approach to working with those issues. Working with the issues around sexual compulsivity is what I mean. So thank you again for having me.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. So I want to get into the interview and start with some questions. And the first thing is, you work with and specialize in trauma, sex, and relationships. What are some issues that you see with your clients that they may be struggling with around those things?
Oh yeah. So I do a lot of work around like complex trauma a lot of times. And so a lot of times with complex trauma, a lot of the clients that I see have realizations that they're that the experiences that they had, like the traumatic experiences they had, like kind of shaped them developmentally, at a young age, and then that ends up impacting their relationships as they get older. A lot of times there's like a lot of repetitive kind of exposure to extreme stressors. Sometimes it's actually extreme neglect, to be truthful, that people kind of have realizations about later on. I also do a lot of work with people on like kind of sociocultural trauma, just because I do so much, work with the LGBTQ plus population, and I do see a fair amount of people of color too, um, being Latino. So a lot of times we will focus on the impact of the culture, the impact of the environment, and stuff too on on the person, but also on like how that impacts like being in relationships and trying to connect and build those connections that people want to have and stuff like that. And sex comes in like a lot of times through like expression and stuff. And so, although I work with a lot of clients who have like sexual trauma, a lot of the clients who I work with who are dealing with like sexual issues, whether it's sexual dysfunctions or maybe even sexual compulsivity, identify that the they don't really have a lot of them don't have that kind of sexual abuse or sexual trauma history, but they still have issues around sex because of their religion, things that they were taught, beliefs they have. There's a lot of, kind of BS beliefs that people kind of have about sex, really poor sex education, on and on. And so so I do a lot of work with people on just kind of ways to express themselves in an authentic way in their relationships with themselves, sexually. So yeah, so that'd be my that'd be what I would say as far as like how I kind of see all those issues in my office.
Okay. Thank you for that. So let's say someone realizes that maybe they have some trauma that stems from, beliefs or sexual abuse or something of that nature. Um, how would someone know when they need therapy, or how would they
Mm.
ask, do I need therapy? What would be some signs that someone could, kind of gather that they need therapy?
Yeah, so I kind of take a little different approach to that a little bit. Like, so the idea of who like needs therapy. So let me say this: like, if things are volatile, you're boundaryless in your relationships, you um, you're unsafe, in some way, um, you're involved in addictive behavior that's extremely destructive, including substances, then I really think you really should consider therapy. um, so there's those really intense situations that people have, that they maybe if it's you're really struggling to function on just a basic level to meet basic needs for yourselves, for yourself. I do think that those are situations where people really should go to therapy. But outside of those extreme things, I think people, the truth is that people often improve without therapy. So when it comes to like whether or not a person needs it, I don't know. I don't think most people need it. I think people can benefit from going. And I tend to just say, hey, if you're thinking about whether or not you should see a therapist, go. So just kind of go do it, see what it's like. Oh, oops, drop that. I meant to move that so it didn't fall. See see what it's like, and see if it's helping you. It's kind of a unique relationship. That's really the goal, is kind of to have this unique relationship with someone where you can kind of work on like kind of processing whatever you want to process in your own life and whatnot. So I just tend to think of like, hey, if you're thinking about it, try it out. See. That's usually the recommendation. I think it's good for people to generally work on themselves, and it's a place where you can do that. It's not the only place. You can do that in a lot of different ways, but it's a resource. that's there. And so I know that's kind of a weird way to answer that, but that's how I tend to answer it. I think that people, most people could probably benefit from building that relationship with someone, and so yeah, if you're thinking about it, try it out, see if you find that person that is someone that you feel like you could open up to and talk to. um, yeah.
Gotcha. Um, because of what you specialize in, I think you may be more equipped to answer this question, and that is that today sex and relationships seem to be such a taboo area, like a gray area that nobody really wants to talk about, or we avoid having those discussions. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think we're still a pretty puritanically based kind of culture, so I think that's part of it. We're pretty up. It's interesting because we're kind of an uptight culture, but we're like an objectively like sexualized culture too, in a way. So we really enjoy objectifying everybody and kind of gossiping, and I'm talking about like mainstream culture really enjoys that. So it's kind of this weird dichotomy. Um, we there's there's a lot of stuff I think where people still struggle with like sex being dirty. Most of our sex ed um, is still, if it's there's still a lot of abstinence based sex education out there, but um, there's still also a lot of education that's really just focused on that sex is to make children, and it's not necessarily, even though people themselves usually know that it's like something that's pleasurable and enjoyable, they don't have the resources of where to kind of go to talk about it openly. And that's so our and that's really not even just most of our a lot of sex ed is in the school system, but a lot of families really struggle to talk about it. So I think because that there's still that kind of, like, if we are going to educate people, we're going to educate them about STIs, like sexually transmitted illnesses, or we're going to educate them about pregnancy, and often try to make those things seem very scary too. So that's like the only conversation we're going to have is sex is really scary and really dangerous. It doesn't really facilitate like, hey, this can be a really great thing, and you're already sexually developing, because we are from birth sexually developing, and it can be fun and pleasurable and enjoyable and expressive. And so I just don't think we've really come to terms with ways to have those kind of conversations. And so and then beyond that, people just kind of then turn to kind of whatever they turn to try to educate themselves. So some people will use pornography as education. Some people will use just pop culture and, stupid magazines and, whatever, that to kind of tell them, what they should be doing, sexually, do these three things, and then sex will be this amazing, blissful thing. So there's also a lot of nonsense out there too. And I think the internet, one other thing I think I'd add is the internet can kind of create, it's a great resource, but it can also kind of create an illusion that you can kind of just go on your own, find the information in private, never talk about it, keep it hidden, don't negotiate that, even if it's with your partner. So I think those things are still just really prevalent in our culture.
I agree. I do think that there is still a huge antiquated component of just what sex is, what it should be, and how it really shouldn't be discussed. And I think we've come a long way as a society and as cultures, but we still kind of hold on to those things a bit. So I agree with what you said for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so one of your posts said, sex addiction is one of the most controversial issues of therapy. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah. So, so I wrote a book on it. That's why I take a big sigh. So there's like a lot of, there's a lot there, but, so you kind of have these forces, I think. On one end, you've kind of got like this sex positivity movement that's really worked really hard to um, make sex something that is, easier to talk about, um, bring awareness to things that, are, so we're coming like we're in a society where, you know, uh, like LGBTQ plus people were largely institutionalized. Those are kind of realities, just kind of our of our culture. A society where women aren't even kind of fully viewed as historically kind of as equal partners in relationships and stuff. And so a lot of the sex positivity movement has been geared towards overcoming those kind of really old historical kinds of things. And the DSM, even today, still really, I think, has like some struggles with sex positivity. If you look at stuff around certain kinds of fetishistic disorders, um, like some of those things can possibly, just depending, be kinks that are among consensual adults. So it's like, why does there need to be a diagnosis about this? So there's still a lot of room for stigma. And on the sex addiction side of stuff, there have been things to like that have kind of hung on to elements of that. So certain things are taboo. You've still got stuff out there like reparative therapy and conversion types of therapy and stuff that are still in existence. So, and a lot of those people who do that treatment will say that they're treating your addiction. So they will kind of use terminology that makes them sound synonymous. You're gay and that's an addiction, for example. They try to link those things together. And and then we've got that stuff that we were just talking about with this taboo stuff about sex. And so if somebody does have like they're wired to have some pretty kinky desire, and they don't talk to anybody about it, it can really cause some extreme, rifts in the relationships. But that doesn't mean it's an addiction. However, there can also be a compulsivity element to it. So the controversy, what I have found in just kind of within itself, is that it's turned into a very political space, and kind of like most of our politics, it gets really extreme to the point of which you have to pick which team you're on, and you have to be loyal to that team. Don't question it. Don't push on it too much, which creates a problem because you, you really, really good research asks lots of questions, considers not how you're right, but actually how you might be wrong, and not that you got everything in the research and you already know. It tries to consider what you don't know. What am I possibly missing here? And because the space has gotten so political, people are making points with, and they've made points with research, and they've developed studies to make a point. And this happens both ways. Um, so you kind of almost just have this tug of war of, well, look, now I'm right. This is science. I'll prove it to you. Oh, wait, no, this is science. I'll prove it to you. And And then I'll add one other thing, and I'm really oversimplifying this all. So, um, I think another part that I actually took out of my book because it started to get so complicated is around porn and porn, like pornography, and whether it's good or bad or healthy, and even in that language, I'm talking kind of in extremes, and so people tend to, because they're kind of, I think, kind of politically aligned a lot of times, and even therapists like to kind of be part of a crowd. They want to be friends. We want to belong. We've got that need to. They're a lot of times feeling like they shouldn't question, but they're kind of over here, so they're making the point about pornography is never an issue. For example, that'd be an extreme perspective. But on the other end, if somebody is spending 8 hours and they are watching it while they're driving and completely avoiding their relationships, there might be an issue there, and so it becomes a space of where it's almost hard to name those things and talk about them. And at the same time, there are people who enjoy pornography. It doesn't cause a problem for them. It doesn't it's consensual stuff in their relationship. And so in the politics of it all, you just have like systems kind of trying to one up each other, and I think what gets lost are the people that we're actually treating, and they have individual stories and individual perspectives too. And we to me, good therapy isn't the therapist putting on clients like, hey, this is my values, and these are my beliefs, and you've got to now take these on, and they have to be yours. It's meeting your client where they're at and helping them figure out in their own kind of lives and their own stories what is a problem, what isn't a problem. And I think the label has kind of derailed that, to where it's now become about these systems proving which one is right. Yet we still got people who are coming in trying to figure the issue out. Is this extreme? Is this out of control? Is this compulsive? Is this too much? Or is this just a desire? Or is this something that I want and I didn't know how to express it? Is it, and you get all of those people when, and if you marry yourself to any particular model, you are just on too far of an end of the extreme. So I hope that makes it as clear as possible.
No, yeah, you did an excellent job explaining it. And I do think because there is this aspect nowadays of the politicizing, and it's right or it's wrong. The issue kind of gets lost in the middle of that, like you said. So
Yeah,
you,
people get lost.
right, even more so, yeah. Okay, so the next question I wanted to ask is kind of in line with what we were talking about. Is what is sexual avoidance?
Yeah, it's it can look a few ways. It can be it's not low desire. Low desire is just low desire, so there's not really it's it most people, if there's avoidance, there is some desire. Um, it's really avoiding. So it can be avoiding sexual expression with yourself. So it could be avoiding things like masturbation, but most of the time, it's in my experience, it's avoiding sex with a partner, sexual exploration, sexual connection. It might also be avoiding talking about sex and opening up in your relationships, about it. That's really what it is. I think. I mean, it's just like it would sound. It's just not take because it can feel vulnerable. It feels really vulnerable to talk about it or share what you're struggling with, or um, I'll even name one other piece, but share what you're struggling with and open up about that, or try things out without it kind of following a script. That can feel really vulnerable. It could also be, I think, the avoidance can be avoiding doing some of your own work around it, like thinking about what you want, thinking about what you need, what's enjoyable to you, expanding on your um, belief systems around sex or your ideas of what sex must look like, avoiding emotions around sex and feeling. Sometimes people can talk about the physical parts of sex and their beliefs about it, and then you ask, what do you want to feel? And they're like, oh, no, 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 we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna talk about that part. So it can be that too, kind of avoiding certain um, aspects of different of viewing sex in kind of more of a holistic way.
I got you. Um, Now, if there was an abuse component to the avoidance, can it be difficult for someone to reestablish a sexual relationship after abuse?
Yes, it can be. Sometimes, sometimes it's the opposite, actually. Where there are really kind of loose boundaries around sex too. Um, but there can be a lot of avoidance, though. Sometimes people are um, they are not clear, like, or they struggle with identifying kind of inside of themselves kind of safety that can feel a little fractured for them in a way. So it's like they could have the intellectual sense of like, hey, this would be safe, but they don't have that kind of felt sense that it's safe or not. And so a lot of times that's really what you kind of get involved with, and like that trauma work is helping people kind of within themselves kind of identify safety and find somebody who's going to be supportive to help them kind of slow it down and um, give them the time and space that they need to name, you know, what they want. Um, or also because we've got those scripts about what sex is, um, feeling okay with like sex being, we kind of just touched each other in an erotic way, not necessarily, you know, had like penetrative sex or anything like that. So sometimes you don't have to do like things that feel like they're too much. But it sometimes it takes an outside source to kind of even name that to somebody, like, oh, I don't have to do what I don't really want to do, and it can still be sexual connection in a way that's pleasurable, enjoyable, but not too much. So the short answer was yes.
Okay, so kind of want to bridge over into this. If now, let's say that there may be some abuse and someone's behavior because of the abuse or because they just don't know how to ask for how to ask to get their needs met or whatever have you, right? And the relationship starts to have some dysfunction and toxicity. How would you define a toxic relationship?
Yeah. So, we were talking kind of before, and I was telling you like most of it was like, okay, yeah, organic, but this is one of those where I was like, this would be good to get concrete. Um, because I think we got to be careful, or I need to be careful about. I think toxicity is kind of like a real marketable thing. I'm even gonna take a weird roundabout way of explaining this. So, when I was building my website, I get really into the like search engine optimization, all that stuff, and so I like to look at like, well, what do people look for? Like what kinds of things should I write about that would resonate with people? Because then you can kind of see what people are searching for. Toxic relationships is something that people really search for a lot. And so it's a term, and I'm not really sure if that's like I'm not sure if my field's responsible for that, or where we like to use that term, and so now that's just kind of resonated, and it's now part of our like kind of society, and people just are familiar with the term. So I had to really think about that, because I think we could say, hey, you two snapped at each other. That's toxic. I don't really think that's toxic in and of itself. And so but there were a few things that one is if it gets physically unsafe, it's toxic. And I kind of think of this toxic as maybe you need some time and space to reestablish safety, um, reestablish your boundaries, do some work on yourself to figure out what you need and want, and then you can kind of turn back to the relationship. So maybe another element is if you completely forget that you're an individual human being, then there's potential for it to get toxic. But even there, I want to be a little careful, because then it just sounds like, well, I forgot about myself for a while at the beginning. Was that toxic? The other one I think is if you are if you're just constantly fantasizing about leaving the relationship, and it's over certain issues that you're doing nothing about, and you just kind of go in this loop in the relationship through this stuff, and maybe it even can get more and more volatile. That I would say can fit a toxic pattern. Whether or not the relationship's toxic, there's certain things to look for, I guess. I think passive aggressiveness is, don't do it, or try to do it less. I shouldn't say don't do it, because we all do some of that, but catch yourself, take ownership, take responsibility. That will detoxify it. Sarcasm and cynicism, I think, are also things that you got to be really careful about, filling your relationship full of those things. And again, they're things that we do. I don't think those things in and of themselves are mean that your relationship's toxic, but you can kind of, there's a counterbalance, like toxins, in our food and stuff. We've got a legal limit of how much we can consume and that kind of stuff. I think that probably there's things that will fill up a toxic bucket, in the relationship. I think probably that lack of physical safety, though, that one to me, that's just toxic, and you need everyone needs to be safe. Yeah. And so I think that's the one I would say definitely. The other ones, I think it's kind of more of a cumulative effect of stuff. And if if you're that miserable, really consider whether or not that relationship is something that you want to be a part of and engage with. Nobody has to be in a relationship with anybody. And so it's sort of like, it doesn't have to work. There are other people out there. And so, yeah, I think it's more about falling into those patterns and and not countering them with enough personal responsibility, personal work, accountability, those kinds of things.
Um, okay, so let's say that it's been established the relationship has some toxicity in it, but the individual who notices it and is trying to better it can't seem to break free from whatever it is that has a hold on them. I guess there's some terminology nowadays for these type of bonds, um, and I think a big one is it's a trauma bond.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be one of those hot buzzwords. So, what is a trauma bond?
Yeah. So people can trauma bond in their relationships. That can look a few different ways. Actually, it can be that they're traumatizing each other, um, which is kind of what I was speaking to when I was talking about, that kind of physical stuff. Um, Maybe if there's like an affair, cheating, those kinds of things, they can kind of potentially create a trauma bond. But really, it's going through a traumatic experiencing and having, so I've heard Gabor Mate talk about this, where he will say traumas are not necessarily what happens to you, but they're what happened inside of you. So if you think of it in that way, there's kind of a shift in both people, but they're going through those shifts simultaneously. And so there can be this real complex dynamic going on of, because it felt um, safe on the outside, this person was the person that I felt really safe with while this happened. Did you ever watch oh, it had Jeff Bridges. It was like a plane crash movie. I cannot think of the name of it right now. Um, Fearless. That was the name of it. And no, okay. He's so in the movie. He's in a plane crash, and there's this little boy who he carries out of the rubble, and I think he just kind of carries him out and just kind of leaves the boy, just kind of with the medics or something, and then he just kind of wanders off in a daze. But he keeps going outside, and the little boy is just kind of like there. And it's a interesting example of like a trauma bond, actually, where this boy's just kind of fascinated by him, and it doesn't go in. That's it. Like you just see the boy kind of occasionally appear throughout, and you'll just notice him, and then they don't talk or anything, but the boy's just really fascinated with him. So that there's this traumatic event, and then this like safety, kind of that happens. So it's really good. What I would say is it's probably in a way some subconscious fulfillment of a need going through that experience, and because that person's whole system hasn't kind of moved beyond that experience yet, there's a draw to to whatever safety or connection is kind of there, um, from the experience itself. So now trauma bonding can kind of happen through repetitive patterns too, like through like so sometimes people reenact relationships or try to resolve relationships, try to rectify things in their, through new relationships and that kind of stuff. So sometimes it can be, the bond can kind of happen in those patterns too, of, um, fear of abandonment, or, um, I don't know how I always end up with this particular type of a relationship. It always starts off well, and then it gets volatile. A lot of times sometimes there's concrete things that people can identify, but a lot of times there's these like just kind of subtle subjective things that are going on that are more difficult to identify, but still that system is kind of drawn to it. And so that there's potential for that as well, to be kind of an element of trauma bonding.
Let's see. Um, okay, so now that we've kind of identified what a trauma bond is, and a few other things that we spoke about, to kind of bridge over into what a healthy relationship would look like, and what elements there would be in a healthy relationship. My question is, what does it mean to build connections with accountability?
Yeah. um, Self awareness. So I think mindfulness is a really critical part of that. When do so there's like a vulnerable willingness also to take responsibility when you notice things, which is really what mindfulness is. And so if you do something and you're like, eek, okay, wasn't my most aware moment, but I really goofed up, um, then own it. And so many times people will go into pretzel shapes to just stay out of taking responsibility for those things and being accountable for them. And so the accountability really, I would say, starts personally, which is practicing being more aware, um, and owning it. When you notice that you may have crossed the line, or at least inquiring. Like, hey, for me, I think I could have done a better job listening or showing up for you, or um, telling you what I need, and and then seeing what their perspective is, and they may say, "Well, I didn't notice that," or "I didn't think that was an issue," or whatever. But you're not owning it for them; like you're owning it, to be kind of in alignment with yourself. So that's really what I meant by accountability, is that you kind of, or mean by accountability, is that you you do work on yourself enough to be able to identify where you might be crossing a line, how you're contributing to the issue, and you try to make changes for yourself to stop those patterns. Um, and hopefully the relationship will get better as a result, but they don't always. So, yeah.
I feel like as long as you're putting forth the effort, um, that's what makes a difference. Now, whether the relationship goes north or south because of that, you can say that you put your best foot forward. So I like that you made that a point as well. That even though you may be holding yourself accountable, the relationship may not get better, but you still need to hold yourself accountable, because it's a relationship you have with yourself that will continue to build. So if that relationship may fail, when you go into your next one, you already have that level of accountability
Yeah.
that you know how to do, and you know. So
Yeah. I think, if you have that, like a lot of times there's a lot of fantasy that goes into how we deal with relationships. So if my partner would just stop doing these five annoying things, and would start you know um, giving me what I want. Usually in therapy, it's a lot of times the love languages. I hear about the love languages a lot, and theoretically, I guess I'm okay with this idea that you've got like these things that you want. I mean, I really think that's that's all the love languages really actually are. But I I'm like, okay, well then you're responsible actually though for asking for those things, and you're responsible for meeting your own needs, and you can meet your own needs. You're an adult, and you can kind of help your partner meet your needs. And if and you're also the one who's responsible for determining whether or not they meet enough of your needs. So you don't have to be in the relationship if they aren't, and refuse to or don't want to or whatever. So yeah, I think that responsibility piece is really important.
I agree. Okay, so while we're here, another one of your posts said, "Don't expect your relationship to get better if you're not committed to it." Can you kind of explain how that ties into what we're talking about?
Yeah, people people almost do it in reverse a lot of times. So I will hear a lot of situations where people are like, um, I will, I want to know if I should, I'm waiting to see what, you know, he, she, they, what they do, um, before, I decide whether or not I'm going to, whether or not this is really something I want. So if they do certain things, then I will make the decision to put on a full effort. And I'm like, decide right now whether or not you're putting effort into this. Instead of going into a fantasy of what it could become, this is what it is and is not. And are you wanting to work on it right now? And you can work on it and try to commit to it right now. And you don't have to. I really stress that you don't have to, because, it's important to have agency. So what do you want? And it kind of, it's there where I think you can kind of determine whether or not you're really wanting to commit to it, instead of like, I think the other one just kicks the can down the road, and it takes that accountability off of you. If you're kind of like saying, well, if I'll commit if these things happen, and if I, it's like, well, why not just make that commitment now, um, either to it or that you're going to commit to move on. And um and so and everyone, I think, has these little waves of ambivalence, in long term relationships. That's different. I think it's kind of like, well, that's just this fleeting kind of thing. But if there's some perseverating in some kind of a way where you're just circling around it over and over and over again, yeah, then you need to decide what you want, instead of like putting it on the other person to figure out the algorithm of you, you know. And so yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at.
That reminds me of something my grandmother used to say back in the day: "Piss or get off the pot."
It's kind of like that. It's kind of, yeah, fish or cut bait. You kind of have those kinds of
Right.
sayings. It's kind of
Exactly.
kind of
Exactly.
like that. Yeah.
So, what are some ways to build a good foundation in a relationship if you decided to commit and you want to be all in?
um Consistency, offering some like consistency. We're just talking real basics. Return to the basics probably would be the best thing I'd say. Can be consistent, open, honest. um Practice getting vulnerable and sharing. I always say that's a practice, because there's times where we'll withhold and shut down and get real small and stuff. But so, practice that. Practice doing more of that. And identify what you need, for to build trust. What kinds of, we often think of trust as like the thing that will be taken away if the most horrible things happen, rather than like this thing that we build. And so it's important that we're aware of like the kinds of things that build trust. Just real basic, nothing. Those things are simple in a way, but they're not actually not that easy, because they again take that kind of self awareness and knowledge and stuff. But yeah, I would say, um, go to those basics.
Gotcha. I appreciate that advice. What I wanted to do now was kind of ask a personal question too, if you don't mind. Um, and the first one is what has been your experience treating individuals struggling with relationships and trauma associated with sex?
Um, it's been, like, simple way of saying, probably challenging yet rewarding. Um, Challenging in that, like, challenging work wise, but I think challenging personally too, because a lot, there like a lot of times, we have to kind of look at where as therapists where we're not, as congruent. So, we can talk a lot. A mentor of mine one time said we're, therapists are kind of voyeurs. I thought that was an interesting way of like, hey, we're just looking at people's lives, and we can, but we, um, you know, I don't think we're at our best if we're doing that. And so I do think that it's important to kind of try to apply stuff personally too. So I think that there's also that piece too that's been kind of rewarding of like challenging myself in a way too. When I see like there's struggles and I can empathize with elements of them, and like, okay, well, I need to be congruent here and try to, I just said this today. Um, am I doing that for myself and stuff too? So I think there can be some personal elements that are rewarding as well. As my from my experience, it could be fun. We were kind of talking about that before, like having fun in what you do. So it could be fun. And yeah, so it's complicated too, but yeah, challenging. It's challenging, but I like the challenge.
I'm sure that because of your experience and your knowledge, it has to be rewarding the more you do it and the more you see the transformation in your clients. So
For sure.
I'm sure they appreciate it as well.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes too, I've learned over the years too that even when you don't see that, and even if sometimes people just aren't ready to, and sometimes it's not a good fit even, but um, that it's like, well, maybe it just I put something out there that will again of like a foundational piece kind of thinking of that they can kind of build on that later too. So sometimes you don't see the outcome that ends up actually happening, so um, I like to see the outcome. I think we all probably transparently kind of do, but uh, yeah, I think that the other rewarding part is like, kind of helping people kind of get in a certain spot, and then, kind of um, putting some trust in that they maybe later on got a little bit of what they needed.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that personal sentiment with us. Um, my last question, or second to last, and this is a bit of left field from what we've been discussing, but I saw this on your one of your posts, and I really wanted to get your feedback on what you meant by it, and it was almost all mental health diagnoses and treatments ignore people of color. Can you kind of break that down?
Yeah, the the research has the representative of, so when you look at like um studies, and you're trying to figure out what they even mean and what's applicable about them, part of the validity is like, well, what's this applicable to? And a lot of the research has historically ex not 100% excluded, but has not been that representative of cultural differences. The DSM itself has some anecdotal things now, probably more than the other ones, about considerations for, you know, different communities of color. But even there, you know, being, Mexican American myself, I'm under no, like I'm in usually lumped in with Hispanics. And, I'm a light skinned, Mexican, which would be a very different experience than if I, were a very dark skinned or, you know, black member of the, kind of Latino community, so there's so much nuance. So that's just kind of one element. Um, I'll even give a different one that's outside of communities of color, but like some of it can be used to stigmatize certain groups. I tend to think of like borderline personality disorder as a diagnosis. I'm not saying there is no borderline personality. I think there is, but that diagnosis is often, this is an annoying woman. I mean, to be honest, and that's a sad reality. This is an annoying woman. So now, because she's getting on my nerves as a therapist, she's now borderline personality. For men, I think there can be, this man is getting on my nerves. He's a jerk, so he's a narcissist. That's another term we love throwing around. Who's a narcissist? And so I think part of it's just in the complication of labels, and what the labels kind of were intended for. And then part of it's just in the representation of a lot of the research. And even so, like the development of the labels, I wouldn't say, I probably would have to do more research to say this for sure, but I'm just going to make an assumption right now that they weren't based on communities of color. And so now we've got the labels, and now we've got to see how they apply to communities of color. So, so like, we've got whatever diagnosis it is, and we pull it out of the DSM, and now we, you know, have to figure out how is that applicable to, and is it even? And I think based on how like the research isn't that representative, I think we could say people of color get depressed or anxious, or they have the emotions. But the whole idea of the DSM was that it was supposed to be like this research-based document, and it's got a lot of limitations, and one of them is who is it representing and how is it representing. And so that's kind of what I was getting at. I think we need to do a better job of researching communities. Another thing I'll say, sort of one other thing, is sort of like, if your sociocultural trauma is not an element that's in the DSM. And so if you have cross-generational trauma, that's coming from several generations, how would you even get diagnosed that? Well, no, because it's not a thing. And then what's the clinical consideration for it? Well, a lot of times there is no clinical consideration. And let's say you're not just an annoying woman, but you're an annoying Mexican woman, and you're really struggling with something that's maybe representative in your community, your culture, maybe you're a lesbian and you're coming out in a community that's not necessarily always easy to, whatever, I don't know. And now you're diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, because you annoyed a therapist who doesn't understand you very well. So those are the things that I was kind of speaking to, is that, we need better representation along with better research, systemic kind of changes, but that's way broader than just the field of psychology, obviously. But yeah.
Right. I was going to say that's another podcast episode if we step into that.
So it's what I would say. Probably my general. Oh, sorry.
No, okay.
My general point is just kind of being real aware of that. Really, that's probably more of a point towards other therapists. Just really being aware of people who are different than you, and knowing your limitations too. And there are limitations, and it's fine to have limitations. So just being aware of those things. That's probably the big takeaway that I was really aiming for in saying that.
Okay. I appreciate you giving us some clarity on that. Okay, so the big one. If you could use your platform to help anyone who may be struggling with anything we spoke about, sexual abuse, just talking to someone about their relationship, about their emotions, their feelings, what have you, and they're on the fence about it, what would you say?
They're on the fence kind of about whether to actually seek that help out.
Correct.
Okay. Um, yeah, I would. I I would say just examine. Yeah, first of all, I'd say you don't have to do anything you don't want to do, and so people don't do particularly well when they're coerced to go to therapy. Um, sometimes they will. There is a way to work with that. We often talk about things like motivational interviewing and stuff. Um, so we've got those cross sections of like the criminal justice system and all these things that don't always um, make it a like something that you can make a decision about. Are you still there's still decisions, there's still choices in it, um, but I would say just examine it, but just be curious about why you don't want to go. If that's something if you feel like I'm not sure that I want to, just be curious about that. Okay, well, what's that about? Just do some internal dialogue about that a little bit and ask yourself those questions. Um, and that's okay. You may have a real legitimate reason for that. That makes a lot of sense to you. So I think it's good to have that permission too. Um, and then maybe kind of explore what's going to actually happen. Maybe if you play it forward a little bit, like, what am I most scared of? What am I, kind of worried about? What am I, um, um, what's the most intimidating thing? And just kind of explore it. And um, the other thing I'd say is, there's lots of pretty good, resources just kind of out there, on the internet. The one thing that I'd say that's generally, if you do search for stuff on the internet of like, hey, what actually happens in therapy? Um, I don't think you're likely to come, a lot of times I'd be like, oh, skip the WebMD and that, kind of stuff. But this would probably be a topic where I think it's probably okay to kind of get online and, do some research and just kind of see what actually happens. Also, maybe talk to somebody. I think people are more open than ever before about being in therapy. And so it's very likely that someone who's going if they haven't already shared that with you. And so you can ask them about it, like, hey, what pros and cons, or what was the hardest part? I'm scared of this. Does that happen? So I think it's good to ask that too. And then you can also, it's fine to reach out to a therapist and say, hey, I'm really scared of this part of it. And how does this, what happens? And see what that there, and different therapists have different perspectives and modalities and stuff too. So they can tell you from their perspective. I tend to lean on the general side of just making a big generalization of what's the harm, just go. But I also think people need to make that decision, kind of for themselves. So I would say just be curious about it. And if you're feeling resistant to it, like, kind of listen to that. And there's probably something to it. It's not that there's, you know, that that it's completely wrong, so in that it might just push you. Maybe you're worried it'll push you farther than, like into too much pain, and you're not ready for that. And for example, you could be right about that. Sometimes when people do go through a trauma, they need time, um, before they can actually get in and kind of process it, and that's okay too. So just exploring those kinds of things.
Hmm. Well, that was great advice. I think if anyone who listens to this was kind of trying to decide what they should or shouldn't do, you just laid the groundwork on what to do. Because, like you said, you don't have to do anything. But
Yeah,
if you do feel a need, and you know, take your time, do your homework, all the things. So,
yeah, and don't take all the time, and just as far as that commitment goes, so you can kind of again make a commitment about like I'm not ready. Your commitment can be, I'll examine it in 6 months.
right.
Okay, yeah. So that's fine, but yeah, make a commitment to doing something, even if it's just re-examining it or just saying no.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Right. All right, Dr. Salas. Well, thank you so much for this. This has been wonderful. We talked about a lot of topics that I think need to be talked about more and need attention. So I was grateful that you were able to do this with me and do it in the way that you did. If someone wanted to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm at Vantage Point TX on Instagram, and I think that's my Facebook. I think it's the same thing. And actually, Facebook I think is just Vantage Point Dallas Counseling. Um,
Okay.
and our website's long. It's vantagepointdallascounseling.com. So they can also go there. And we've got a really quite a big blog on there too. So if they wanted to go on there and just kind of, research, just there's a lot of free advice on there about, relationships and trauma and coming out and all kinds of stuff on there. So they just wanted to kind of explore that. And yeah, and, my book is sold on Amazon. It's called Bridging the Sex Addiction Divide, and it's also on Sano, SANO press.com. So if people are interested in that, they can go to those places as well.
All right. Well, again, thank you for doing this with me, for the masterful way you handled the hard questions and topics that we talked about, and for who you are and what you do.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.